you get that fantastic blue in the sky. And that's part of the characteristics of our atmosphere. But when we actually put pollution in the atmosphere, what you'll notice is the blue starts to fade out. And so in a sense, that blue sky is a bit of an indicator of what's going on in terms of pollution. And some of that pollution can warm the earth, like greenhouse gases, and some of that pollution can cool the earth. Sulfate particles from coal-fired power stations, for example. And what we see winning out depends on where you are. And so in some places on the earth, we're getting pollution, which is warming the planet and warming locally, and some places it's actually cooling that a little bit. And so how that pollution plays out in terms of blue skies is very standard. You know, we get our skies paler and paler, the more pollution, the harder it is to see the blue. But it plays out differently in terms of greenhouse and climate change.
Absolutely. So on that, how would you say this pollution and greenhouse gas emission is impacting the skies in Australia and ASEAN region?
Well, fairly typically where you have lots of built up activities, so cities with traffic, coal-fired power stations, similar power stations, we're producing lots and lots of pollutants, particulates and gases of different types. And so if we look at the the big concentrations of additional gases and pollutants we're putting in the atmosphere, it's very much centered around our cities. And then separate from that, we have particular locations where you might have a big mine or a big factory of some sort, or in some cases agriculture, which has a much more diffuse set of pollutants. So they're spread out more across our different countries. And so again, we see quite different sets of activities which generate those greenhouse gases and pollutants in different places at different times. So in some times of the year, we might have our air conditioners turned on and we're producing lots of energy related things, and other times we may have them turned off, and so we produce less. And on the weekends, our travel in our cars is different from how we travel during the weekdays, and so we have different pollutant patterns depending on day of week.
Absolutely. It's definitely quite a complex problem with many different variables to consider. And with a focus on the ASEAN-Australia region, how is this issue then represented in our international collaboration and policy making, to address these different emissions that are occurring, and of course across the different industries that are producing them, from our cities to our coal-fired plants, especially in Australia, to major agricultural areas?
Yeah. Oh, and it's a big question there, Danielle. so I guess at the highest level, in organisational sense, we have the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Conference of Parties, and particularly the Paris Agreement that pretty much every country, yours and mine, signed several years ago. And so that actually has commitments in there for each country to set its own pollution reduction level and devise its own way, work out its own way of meeting that commitment of emission reduction. And those commitments were different. So it would be different from Australia, say, to Vietnam, or Australia versus Indonesia. And that reflects the different circumstances our different countries have. And the pathways to reducing those greenhouse gas emissions and to adapt to the climate change is also going to be very different between our different countries. So different for Papua New Guinea than it would be for Fiji. And so what we see is different commitments and different pathways to those commitments, which reflect the situation in each country. But some things are very consistent across countries. So for example, if we wanted to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from our transport, the solution is largely having electric cars. And an electric car that works on a road in Japan is the same as an electric car that works on a road in India. And solar panels that we put on our roofs or in agricultural fields, the solar panels that work in China are the same ones that work in Malaysia. And so a lot of those solutions in terms of emission reduction are very, very similar across different countries and different contexts. Whereas that adaptation, that response to climate change, is often highly contextual. So how a farmer in Indonesia will respond will be very different from a farmer in Australia.
Of course.
I guess there's one other thing there is that is consistent, and that is our goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and manage climate change needs new things. It needs new ideas. It needs new technology, new ways of organizing ourselves. That's new institutions, new motivation for public action. And in many cases, there's common elements across our countries. So we see youth movements, which are very common across countries, often having coordinated activities. Similarly, we can see research and development in the science domain, where countries cooperate across country borders, trying to look for those solutions, because good solutions help us all.
Absolutely, some great points there, and definitely some room for some international collaboration, and great to hear that youth are one of the driving pillars for that. Focusing now on agriculture, which is a key area for the ASEAN and Australia economies, what are the major challenges and also opportunities faced by this industry in regard to addressing climate change and our pollution?
One of the major, I should frame it, agriculture is directly responsible for almost a quarter of our greenhouse gas emissions globally. And when we link it in with the food system, so it's things like food processing and transport, it's almost a third of our greenhouse gas emissions. So food that we eat contributes almost as much greenhouse gas emissions as our electricity system. So electricity is the single biggest component. Agriculture isn't far behind. So it's a very big emitter, and it happens pretty much everywhere. So every country, to all intents and purposes, has agriculture. And so we're all sort of producing food, producing greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, we all eat food. And so we're all, in a sense, responsible for those greenhouse gas emissions. And so it's one of those very common elements that we just talked about in the previous question. And the challenge in agriculture is that we don't have the simple solutions. We don't have the simple solutions that, oops, you're just starting up the video or something.
We've just lost your video, but we can still hear you clearly.
Okay. Oh, there we go.
There you go. You're back.
Don't know what happened there. But anyway, so one of the problems with agriculture is that we don't have the simple standard solutions that we do in other sectors. So we don't have the electric vehicles, which can work everywhere. We don't have the solar panels, which can work everywhere where the sun shines. And so there's a challenge there in terms of reducing the emissions from that sector. So the first thing we can do, though, is we can make those sectors more efficient. So if we make the agriculture cropping systems more efficient, so we use fertilizer more efficiently, so you lose less into the environment, less through leaching or less through volatilization, that's gas formation into the atmosphere, then we can reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions per kilo of wheat or rice that we produce. So the first thing we need to do is become more efficient. The second thing we need to do is reduce waste. So some estimates indicate that we waste almost a third of the food, or we have loss and waste of almost a third of the food across the globe that we produce. And so by reducing loss, we don't have to produce as much. We don't have to push our systems as hard. And then the next thing we need to do is look at the big emitters, and they tend to be livestock-based systems. And so that's cattle, beef cattle, dairy cattle, sheep and goats in particular. And again, for some cattle or some livestock in some places, we can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by changing their diet, and we can give them additives in their diet, so that sort of additional chemicals or seaweed sort of products and things in their diet, which can reduce methane emissions. And some of those solutions are better than others. Some of them are probably safer than others. And we still have a lot to go, a lot of work to do to work out what are safe and effective and cost-effective ways of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. Because when we do that, what we'll find is that if we do it well, it will not only help the global environment, but it will help the farmers, because they're losing less nitrogen from their system, they're losing less energy from their system, they're becoming more efficient, they're going to become more able to produce the sorts of food that people want.
Absolutely. So there's some quite good innovations and everything, and of course different aspects that contribute not only to us working towards reducing climate change, but also improving our developmental opportunities, it seems. Is there any particular innovations that you've seen in this field that are quite interesting and something you think could be rolled out across the world shortly?
In terms of greenhouse gas emission reduction?
Yeah, in terms of greenhouse gas, whether it's to do with food wastage or the emissions from our livestock.
Yeah. So with livestock, one of the things we can do is we can breed animals which produce less methane. So it's a slower process than the sort of chemical additives, but we can actually select from the cattle or sheep or goats in our flocks and select for those animals which produce less methane, and then we can breed them up. And so we can actually breed into those animals reduced greenhouse gas emissions. And that means you're no longer dependent on industrial type inputs, or you're no longer dependent on the management capability of a farmer, a good farmer versus a poor farmer, because it's already built into the animals. And I think that's a pretty interesting proposition where we can start to think about much more long-term systemic changes that can deliver good benefits.
Sounds great.
So Mark, I mean, there's so many fascinating things to touch on from that, but I'd like to swing the conversation in the direction of perhaps some of those new innovative solutions that you brought in there. And ASEP focuses on young people. And I was wondering if you could speak to how do young people take on the challenges of international and interdisciplinary cooperation, because that seems to be quite at the core of our capacity to go forward and actually combat some of these transboundary problems.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So I think the first step is actually dialogue. It's actually finding out about the circumstances in which each other operates. What our lives are like and what our goals are like. And for me, the starting point for any action in climate change or anything else really is actually understanding the values and the aspirations that people have. So what is it that you really want? What are the things that you're prepared to really work hard for? And by having that conversation, I think you often find that the values that other people hold mysteriously aren't the values that you hold. And so what it reveals is diversity. And all of a sudden, that diversity can become a real fantastic weapon that can become a really great benefit to finding solutions. Because if you only deal with the same sorts of people, you won't be able to explore the solution space. And so what I'd be suggesting is engage with people from other countries, other disciplines in science, other job type activities, people with other goals, other ways of viewing the world, and actually have a respectful conversation with those people and really listen to them. And probably coming out of that will start to come ideas which can actually work for both of you.
I think that's really interesting, because I feel as though a lot of young people are very interested in engaging with the dialogue now. It's been a movement, as you've mentioned, but we're interested as well in that moving towards action. And it feels like some of the incredible innovations that you have mentioned, and we've heard about them ourselves as well, on not necessarily getting to a point where there's that kind of mass action that is going to meet the deadlines that we need to meet in order to make this future that we're going to inherit something that's more tolerable. And I was wondering, how do you move from a place of dialogue, which I agree is completely necessary, to a place where that gets implemented in the timescales that we have?
Look, another great question. So one of the things that tends to happen when we have dialogues, say, about climate change, is that the focus tends to be on the things that we as individuals can do. So change our diet, eat less meat, those sorts of things. Don't drive your car, ride your bicycle, turn off the lights, reduce the air conditioner temperature, those sorts of things. So one of the first things, because we have control, because we can do something about those things, is to focus down on the individual behaviours. And that's good, it's useful, and it helps people get started. But the real challenge in terms of meeting the Paris Agreement goals is not about individual behaviours. It's actually about changing the system in which we operate, changing the reward system in which people make one decision versus a different decision. That can be through, say, carbon taxes as one instrument of changing those decisions. It can be changes through energy policy or research and development. It can be setting up institutional arrangements which work across boundaries. It can be setting up networks which work across boundaries. And so it's not, there's many different solutions here, but at some stage we have to move the conversation from the individual behaviours into the system, and it's about changing the system. And to do that, the way most of our countries work is that you have to be able to engage and influence politicians or senior level bureaucrats or heads of companies. And a lot of the time, the conversation with those people tends to be negative, like, and very normative, like, you should do this or don't do that. Whereas I think oftentimes a conversation that works a bit better is you do your homework and you find out what the values, again, the values and aspirations of those politicians and those company leaders are. And then you have a conversation which is, it's inclusive. It says, okay, you're doing this, and what about if you could do this as well? And then you say, wouldn't it be great, and wouldn't it generate some opportunities if you did this thing? Because there's a whole swell, groundswell of people who are prepared to pay for that or who are prepared to vote for that. And so instead of approaching it in a negative way, don't do this, approach it in a really positive way, which says, what about doing this? What about trying this? And if you're engaged in that conversation, oftentimes, people will think in terms of risk. They will think, oh, well, what's the risk to me? What am I going to lose if I do this? So part of that conversation is finding ways to reduce that risk. So if they do something different and take something on board and try to respond in a positive way, how can you help them make that a lower risk, better sort of prospect for them, so that they're actually inclined to do it? And when you do that, if you can do that well, all of a sudden, instead of having to push against the system, you've got the system working for you.
Fascinating. Yeah, I couldn't agree more that there does seem to be an ideology clash that comes out of this, and that's what it feels like. A lot of young people looking at politicians and policymakers see a lot of fear-mongering and a lot of it becomes an ideology rather than looking at action. And that's actually leads on to another thing I'd love to ask you about is actually, interestingly, in this situation, the private sector seems to be moving at a pace that governments don't seem to be able to, and they have that attitude that you were mentioning that's focused on the opportunities rather than the issues. And as a result, they have seemed to they seem to have been able to make this huge progress with those innovations and getting them out to where people need them. And I was wondering if you could speak to the role of the private sector in this transition when we see governments failing consistently to do that initial capital investment to help everyone follow suit. The private sector seems to have gone ahead and done their own thing. And that's quite interesting, theoretically, to see this really global problem that private sector is now engaging with more than government. But I'd love to hear your perspective on the future of the private sector almost leading this charge.
Yeah. So absolutely. And I think what we saw, say, in the Paris Agreement, the reason why we got the Paris Agreement wasn't because governments all of a sudden said, hey, there's new scientific information that says climate change is a real problem. It wasn't because they all of a sudden got a green tinge and felt that they had a responsibility to the future of the planet. I actually think it was largely because the business community all of a sudden saw there was a buck to be made out of climate change. And they said to governments, sign up. We actually want you to engage in this. So rather than having a conversation which is don't do this, they actually said, here's a conversation, we really want you to sign up the Paris Agreement. And that's how the momentum developed there. So I think the business community has had a political sort of influence there, but obviously it's had a huge market influence as well. So, for example, Tesla and electric vehicles. In the end, there'll be many other competitors for Tesla, but Tesla really opened the door, I think, to what could be done with electric vehicles. So instead of it being a clunky, horrible car to drive, they actually said, well, we're going to make, an electric car the sexiest, fastest car on the road. And it'll cost you money, but you're actually going to be driving something, if you've got the money, you're going to be really happy about driving. And so, again, sort of taking the opposite view of how often climate change is presented. But having said that, is that if you say, look at expansion of renewable electricity in a country like Australia, is that there's a lot of money, there's a lot of businesses, there's a lot of individual investors who want to invest in renewables, who want big solar farms and wind turbines and batteries and pumped hydro systems, and that's actually being stopped, not fully, but hampered, limited by government policy in relation to energy systems and networks and regulation in those systems. And so even where you have an intense push by the business because they see the profit motive, they see the money that can be made out of change, it doesn't necessarily happen if you've got policies and practices and regulations which are set by government which prevent that from happening. So I think even with all the good intent of businesses and the momentum that businesses can have, you still have to line up the policies and institutional arrangements at the same time. And that's where you can really make the big change, where you have the populace wanting to go in one direction, business also seeing for quite different motivations wanting to go in that direction, and the government supporting both of them to do that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it feels like in our region in particular, there seems like a lot of opportunities that are being taken with the Sun Cable as an example, with this enormous project that's putting solar panels up in Darwin and exporting it underground to Singapore, which is, it sounds like we've welcome to the future kind of thing.
You might be, on that topic, Marina, yeah. You might be interested that idea has been around for a long, long time.
Really?
So this has been around for something like 15 years, and people basically identified, all of the pieces were there, but the politics of it and the economics of it simply didn't add up until now. And so it's an idea that's been there, but the time for it has only just emerged because of very cheap solar. And so very interesting. You can have the idea, you can have the momentum from the public sector and the private sector, etc., but it doesn't necessarily happen until all of the things line up. And that's the sort of thing that I'm saying, is that we need an integrated response where all of the things, public attitudes, business activity and investment, government activities, and the technology all work together. And that's the sort of thing that we need to keep our eye on, because if just a single one of them doesn't work, if the government doesn't work, or we haven't got the technology, or the business community isn't behind it, or the public, then it won't work anywhere near optimally. So it's about having that view that when we want to make progress, you have to make progress on all of those different components.
Absolutely. It does. As a young person, it feels like the stars need to have aligned before anyone feels that it's the right time to do anything. And I suppose we are at a number of tipping points, in terms of our planetary boundaries, but also at this tipping point in terms of now we are at the right time where all these incredible innovations that perhaps have been in the pipeline can get out and make the impact that they have the potential to make. And that's really interesting. A person listening today has asked specifically about that role of young people, about the role of protests. So if we've just spoken about the private sector is taking these opportunities because of the money that can be earned in that space, and governments are still sitting on their hands to a large extent. But what is the role, or your opinion of the role of these young people's protests, and what is that role in speaking up to politicians to tell them that this is what we expect of our future leaders?
Yeah. So I think when it comes to protest particularly, there's some very different views. So there's some views which are going down sort of the peaceful protest route and being very well behaved, and there's another view which is more Extinction Rebellion, which is that hasn't worked, and so we need to go down a different pathway and be badly behaved, or in a sense cause more disruption. And I don't know the answer to which is a good option. My own personal preference is to actually take the moral high ground. So to do the right thing in the right way, because that will win hearts and minds better than doing things which some people will see as the wrong way to do it. And so if you want to get almost universal buy-in, then you go down the Mahatma Gandhi sort of approach, which is in the end you win because everyone has seen that you live by the words that you speak and your actions match your goals. And so for me, that's a really powerful argument. The challenge here is that we haven't got a lot of time. Every year we're producing 40-something billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent greenhouse gases, and our budget of our emissions that's consistent with staying below 1.5 degrees is very small, like around about 450 billion tons. So less than 10 years worth of emissions at our current rate. And we've blown our chance to stay below 1.5 degrees. And so 10 years goes by in the snap of a finger, like it just incredibly quickly. And so we haven't got a lot of time. We can't take this in a thing that says, okay, well, by 5 years, we're going to have 20% of the population lined up and this, etc. And then by 10 years, we're going to get critical mass. Well, 10 years is in a sense a bit too late. So I don't know the answer to this, but I am pretty sure that ultimately by getting a huge number of people on side, having mass demonstration of your intent, and whether that's physical presence or digital presence, then that will start to work, because ultimately governments can't do things which the vast majority of the population don't agree with. Is that ultimately in the democracy, and even in other political systems, governments ultimately have to align with strong public opinion. To do otherwise, it means they end up losing power one way or the other. And so I think probably my answer to that one would be find really smart and new ways of demonstrating the numbers of people and demonstrating commitment to doing things differently.
Absolutely. I think your audience here tonight could not be more aware of the we don't have enough time issue. And I suppose another question that's come up that I think is very related is a lot of people, young people, are moving into leadership roles, not only in politics, but in business and other sectors as well. And perhaps there is room to move this immense frustration and anger in a lot of situations into action in different spaces like that, as we become the leaders that are taking the reins. And we have a participant who's interested in your advice or practical tips for young people who are interested in getting involved in any leadership positions, and if there's anything you have to say to them.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
You go into a bookshop and you'll find 50 books on how to be a leader type thing. I don't know that I can add to that, but for me there's a simple little comparison here, and that is that oftentimes when we look at organizations, we mistake leadership for management. So it's organizing efficiently how we run our system, sort of thing. That's a management goal. So management is doing things right. So doing things well, doing things right. Leadership is about doing the right thing. So leadership is actually identifying what is the right goal to be heading in, the vision, that we need to be moving towards. And then you get managers to plot out the pathway and to take you along on that journey efficiently. But that's a very different role, which requires a very different skill set and a very different level of commitment. And my view on leadership is that, we're almost enculturated. We're almost sort of given the idea that leaders are always those on the TV or, on actors or well-known sports people or something like this. These are people who are in a sense at the top of the sort of public exposure almost. And I think that's a really bad way to frame leadership, is that why would you entrust the future of your nation to someone who's just good at playing sports and hitting a white ball a long distance, or something like that? You actually have to say, okay, what is it that we want out of our leaders, and who are the people from everywhere that can actually demonstrate those characteristics? And so we need to be wise in our choice of leadership. Even when we're not leading ourselves, we need to be wise in the choice of the leadership and who we support in terms of leadership. And we need to be prepared to step up and do leadership roles ourselves. But really importantly, for me, leadership is as much about taking control as it is about letting go of control. So oftentimes we see people who take on leadership roles and they grasp control of the issue, they develop a leadership role of some sort, but then they don't let go at the time that they should, and they hang on too long. And I think part of choosing good leaders is actually trying to choose people who are going to let go at the right time and pass the baton, pass the sort of mantle onto the next person who can do an even better job.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, because I think a lot of those leadership books in the library feel somewhat redundant in a space where everything is so unprecedented for all of us, and there is precious few examples of anything like this that's happened before and people who've led through that. So it is very valuable to get more current leadership insight. And with regard the different levels of leadership that you were mentioning, do you think there's space for environmental management at a more local level, or environmental leadership, I should say, at a more local level? Or is the transnational solution the only way to go? Because there is transboundary problems, but as you said, particularly with adaptation, whilst mitigation might have some commonalities between different areas, those adaptation measures are very different on the ground. And I'm wondering if you could speak about the localized leadership.
Yeah, look, my view is, just as I said, leadership can come from anywhere. So leaders can come from anywhere, and similarly, good ideas can come from anywhere. And so to be exclusive about good ideas being, operating at national level just doesn't work. Is that we have to have good ideas at household level, at community level, state level, national level, global level, and those ideas can come from anyone at any time. And it's a question about how do we identify those ideas and how do we support them. And so these days there's a lot more things like accelerator programs and incubator programs, which help people work out how to take an idea from the very start to a change of some sort, a product or a change in practice in a different place. And so thinking about those accelerator and incubator programs and possibly generating your own. So rather than having grey-haired people like me sort of run these programs, generate youth-led incubator programs and accelerator programs, and start to use those to bring in people from different places with different backgrounds.
Absolutely. Yeah, we appreciate that. I suppose as a youth-led organization, that's something that we try to lean into a little bit. And it is great as well to create collaborations and partnerships with people who've led before, like yourself. And we've had a question which I think is really important tonight, because you spoke clean air for blue skies. I suppose the blue skies, you talked about the symbolic element of blue skies and how we relate to that on quite a personal and cultural level. But we've had a question about remaining positive in the face of such enormous challenges, where oftentimes it feels like, wow, have we missed the boat entirely? Can we do this? And of course, you keep pushing on, but how to remain positive in that space, and what is your story with becoming engaged with the environment and remaining proactive and positive in that space, despite knowing so acutely how difficult the challenges are that we're facing?
Yeah. Look, I guess, you know, it's a very personal thing, I think, in some ways, and because everyone has their own you know, way of relating to the world and their own experiences, and so I can really only talk about mine, and I don't have qualifications in psychology, and so I can't really generalize. But for me, there's a couple of things. One is that the goal that you're aiming for, in a sense, has to be definitively or distinctively the right goal. You know, that this is actually something which benefits people and it benefits the planet. And in a sense, if I was you know, aiming for the wrong goal, you know, the motivation to stay, you know, active and committed would be very, very limited. And so in a sense, you know, setting that goal and being confident that it is the right goal is a really important start. And so for me, I actually, my own personal story was, when I was at first year university, I'd started off doing chemical engineering, and within 2 weeks of starting that course, I knew that this wasn't me, that somehow it just didn't match my values. And so I sat down and said, well, what am I going to do at that point? And I sort of, in a sense, looked forward to essentially this time now. My sort of goal of looking forward was 2020, and I said, so what's the world going to be like in 2020? And what's a worthwhile goal to aim for throughout my career? And I said, because it wasn't fundamentally climate change at that time, but I had actually, you know, I understood a bit about climate change then. But my thing that I identified was there'd be a fundamental clash between economic development, particularly agricultural activities, and the environment, and that this would play out, you know, everything from global to local. And so that's where I decided to put my efforts in finding solutions in that sort of environment, economic sort of space. And so, you know, I've zigzagged in different ways towards that. And so there's no direct lines to your goal. There's always, you know, you zigzag and do diagonal moves. But that's one thing, actually having the goal. Secondly, is that you actually have to have hope. You have to actually have hope that it's achievable, and that this is something that you can actually make happen, and that you can make a difference. And thirdly, you need to have the capacity, both individually and collectively through your friends and networks and professional societies and others, that you can bring to bear the you know, the needed analysis, the needed understanding of institutional arrangements, the needed understanding of psychology, that you can actually make progress, that you can have a pathway. So you need that capacity as well as the hope and the goal. And so if you sort of break it down like that, you know, it's where do you want to go? You know, are you sure you can get there, and are you sure it's the right thing to do? And what's the pathway there that you can actually make happen?
Thank you.
Absolutely agree with that. There's many different options, and of course you don't need to just be studying science as well. So you decided to change from chemical engineering. What did you end up studying? And if perhaps you had stuck with chemical engineering or found a different pathway, where do you think you would be now, and what would you be doing to address these challenges?
If I'd stuck doing chemical engineering, where I'd be now is I'd be sitting at home talking to an ASEAN youth group. Because
still be here today.
No, I mean, in a real sense, I mean, the details might vary, but if you are committed, and if you've done your strategic analysis right, and you've got the right goal, is that you will be converging on that. and you will, by necessity, have developed some of the skill sets that I mentioned that take you towards on that journey. And so, so in a sense that, I think if I'd done chemical engineering, my interest in the environment would have still taken me into that environmental engineering domain, and I would have probably still found my way to dealing with climate change in some way or other, because it's such a huge issue which needs resolving. It just means my skill set, my background would have been a bit different. So, I'd be better at differential equations and vector analysis and things like that. But for me, I think the jump there was from chemical engineering essentially into environmental sciences. So I did ecology, soil science, climatology, those sorts of subjects, and immediately it felt right. As soon as I'd made that jump, it just felt like the right call for me. And so for me, that's really important, because if you live a life which is separate from your values, so if you're doing something which you commit a lot of your life to, so you have to admit that if in our working lives we commit a lot of time, we commit a lot of energy, mental and other energy to that, and if that's all to doing something that's in opposition to your values, what you're just setting up is major psychological stress. Where your brain says you want to go one way and you're doing something completely different. So that's called psychological dissonance, and it's a source of stress, and that would lead to an unhappy life. And we've only got one of these lives, so why would you want an unhappy life?
Absolutely, and you can't help but go back to the old saying that if you do something you love, you'll never work in a day in your life. And I think that holds true no better more than for your values. Just on that point as well, of course, you've been a part of many different international panels, you've wrote endless research papers, and you've worked with different communities and groups. Besides the environmental science pathway that you've invested yourself in, what other key areas of study are important, especially for the youth that we have here today? Not everyone is interested in science. I know I personally am scared of differential equations, so if I can avoid those, that would be great. What other pathways are there, and how can we contribute to this fight as we live out our values?
Thanks, Danielle. I actually think you said just before there's a huge number of pathways, and that's the answer that I'd give as well. In a sense, the challenge ahead of us is not understanding the fundamentals of climate science, although we still need to continue to improve our understanding of that. The challenge is about change processes, in my view. So it's how do we change those industrial processes? How do we change those institutional processes? How do we change the conversations that are happening in our media, that put barriers in front of us about climate change or misinformation? And so for me, and I've written this up in papers, but it's about that handing on the responsibility idea that I introduced before. And so at the start of climate change, it was very much a sciencey, understand climate, understand the ocean currents, mass balance, energy budgets, that sort of stuff. But once you actually start to move into the components of emission reduction and adaptation, then all of a sudden you need a whole range of different skill sets. You need people who understand how plants work, and people who understand how economics works, and so that's about sort of taking it into the pragmatic realm. But beyond that, we need to actually be taking this into the realm of the psychology and the institutional dimensions of change, and that requires political scientists, it requires social scientists, it requires psychologists. One of the areas that I find really interesting is work that a young colleague of mine, Rebecca Colvin, or Beck Colvin, does. And she's a social psychologist, works in environment. And so she particularly works on identities and how there's all of this identity politics that comes into play these days. You see it playing out, for example, in the US. If one of the Democrats says I'm for something, then immediately the opposition, the Republican says, well, if they're for it, I'm against it, and you have this identity thing that plays out. No no space there for rational discussion, no space there for data, for sensible discussion of options, no room there for new ways of thinking or doing, because the identity just gets in the way immediately. It stops everything from happening. And so for me, that's a really exciting thing, understanding how identity systems work individually and, right through our systems is an important part of solving the problems that we've got. And so I think there's lots and lots of areas where we can explore. I've written a bit on ethics and trust, and I think that's an area which is really important as we move down that sort of spectrum from the hard science to the soft science. We need to be asking questions about the ethics of what we're doing, and we need to ask about the relationships, the trust relationships we've got, and is too much trust a good thing? And the answer is you can have too much trust, like just more trust is not necessarily good. So you need to be thinking about how do you build up critical analysis skills in everyone across our society, not just in the elite, but everyone, so they can actually do their own assessment of what's believable and what's not, and what are the good things to do and what aren't. And so there's a huge education challenge ahead of us. And almost at the bottom of that, or at the top, depending on how you want to look at it, there's this fundamental requirement, which is actually asking us, how do we know what is the right thing to do? So it's sort of beyond leadership. It's into that domain of statesmanship or something like that, which is actually the ability to really look big and identify what is that universal right thing to do. And that's one of the big challenges. And I'm not sure that we can teach that. I think that bubbles up from people.
Absolutely, some great points there. And just going back quickly, touching on that and also the role that innovations can play, it seems like we do have quite a lot of innovations that we can implement it at the moment, but of course our major barriers are psychological, and of course that leads into the political and economic round. But we have a specific question from the audience at the moment, and they're asking, solid waste is a current issue across all of the globe, but for developing countries in Southeast Asia, it's an issue that's often overlooked. Why do you think that this is overlooked, and what solutions are widely available and utilised in other parts of the globe that could be adopted within this region, and how do we go about adopting them?
Well, I think part of the secret is in the word waste. As soon as you give something the terminology waste, you are automatically downgrading its value. And so rather than sort of seeing it as a resource or an opportunity, you're immediately dismissing it. And because we immediately dismiss it, we bury it. We put it in a landfill and cover it with soil, or we throw it in the ocean and hope it sinks to the bottom and we never see it again. So as soon as you label something waste, there's the tendency to bury it psychologically or bury it physically. And so one of the first things to do is have that conversation, which actually elevates the status from waste to a potential resource. And as soon as you identify it as a potential resource, then the question is, what can we do with that, and how do we do that? And then there's financial questions. Does it pay, or do we have to have some subsidy to do that? And then we want to think about essentially closing the loop. So it's the circular economy ideas. So rather than just seeing a recycle thing, you actually see that as a resource which can be used again and again and again and again, not in a random way, but in a very orderly way. And in the EU, for example, there's a big push towards the circular economy. And I actually think that's a really exciting area of work. How do you actually line up all of the incentives, policy incentives and other incentives, so that you actually start to get that circular economy moving? Because once it's moving, you don't have to dig up as much. You don't have to, produce as much energy. Everything becomes more efficient, and everything becomes much more targeted, so that when you actually use something, you actually know the past of that item and you know the future of that item.
Fantastic. Yeah, circular economy is definitely something I encourage all of you right now to look into, whether it's from food to fashion or technology. But going back into other different innovations and opportunities that we do have that necessarily aren't something that we can physically see and reestablish into something else, how would you then address aspects of new adaptation options and mitigation options such as carbon capture and storage technology? Do you think these are viable in us meeting Paris climate agreements?
I guess specifically carbon capture and storage, we've been talking about that for a long, long time, like 40 years or something. And in very limited circumstances, that technology can work. So we can re-inject carbon dioxide down into the geological strata where we've got gas or oil from, and we think, oh, that's good. But usually, what the origins of that technology was not to be green, but was actually so you could push out the remaining gas or oil, and so you could actually strip out every scrap of carbon from that system and use it. And so in the process, you generate, there's lots of carbon losses that come, carbon dioxide losses. So even though it was promoted as a green thing to do, it was actually just done for money. That's the brutal truth of it. The problem is that most of our energy production and consumption does not happen in a location where carbon capture and storage is viable. And so for either geological reasons or economic or infrastructure reasons. And so relatively small amounts of our total carbon footprint are going to be available for that technology, even if we manage to solve a lot of the problems. So those problems include when you push carbon dioxide underground, it takes an enormous amount of energy. So it actually reduces the energy yield, say, of your oil mine. So if you're mining, you've got an oil well and you're getting oil out of that, and oil equals energy sort of thing. But then you've got to use 40% of that energy in that oil to re-inject the carbon dioxide from that down into the mine. You've automatically reduced significantly the energy yield of your system. And so at some stage, your energy yield drops down to close to zero, in which case there's basically absolutely no point in, financially or otherwise, in terms of mining that. So that's one thing, is the energy yield issue and the massive amounts of energy needed to re-inject. The secondly is that when you inject gas down into a strata, there's a lot of pressure there, and you can get fracturing of the geological strata, and then you can get leakage of that carbon dioxide up through your system. And so when you get that fracturing, you can get things like there's a river in Queensland in Australia where you can throw a match on the river and it'll explode in flames, because there's methane which is bubbling up in that river from the fracturing that's happening from the nearby coal seam gas operations. And so those are things that are hard to measure and hard to estimate, but they're actually losses to the system, to the geological system, and additions to the atmosphere, which makes climate change worse. So I would say, with a very few exceptions, give up on carbon capture and storage. A much more interesting prospect is carbon capture and use. So instead of treating carbon dioxide as a waste product, that horrible word that we talked about just before, see it as a resource, and saying, okay, well, can we actually use that to make useful products? So can we use that carbon dioxide and make a petrol substitute, so that we don't have to burn fossil fuels, extract oil to make petrol. We can actually extract it using renewable energy from the atmosphere to make a petrol substitute, and then we can run our vehicles without a greenhouse gas emissions, because any carbon dioxide that's produced from your car is just part of a cycle which gets sucked back into the system in the next time around. We can use it to make polymers. We can use it to make all sorts of building materials, carbon dioxide. We can use it as part of, we combine it with rocks to carbon dioxide can be absorbed by rocks and in gypsum in our houses and various other products. So there's lots of ways we can capture carbon dioxide, incorporate it into high value products, and we can use those either just as a substitute for fossil fuel, or lock it up for a long, long time in different products like rocks or houses or roads. And so for me, give up on carbon capture and storage, focus on carbon capture and use, and generate new industries and innovation, new opportunities for everyone.
Fantastic. And just, of course, to bring that back to the overall aim that we are currently having in the world, which is to meet our SDG goals and, of course, reduce climate change, making sure we hit the lowest possible increase in temperature. Just a quick question on what do you think our progress is overall towards meeting those SDGs, in particular the ones regarding clean air and, of course, blue oceans?
Yeah. Look, I'm not sure I have the numbers at my fingertips, but I think the answer we'd give 6 months ago, pre-COVID, is probably different from the answer we've got now. So I think there's been significant steps backwards in terms of achievement of some of the SDGs. So particularly in the developing world, tourism, remittances, a whole range of different income streams into those countries have been removed. A whole stack of the export streams have been removed because of COVID. And so we've actually gone backwards, I think, in terms of the SDGs. But in terms of sort of blue skies and things like that, I think the SDGs are a really important, essentially, set of metrics, a set of goals, combination of those two things, which probably people argue aren't perfect, but they're actually a pretty good step towards starting to reconcile different parts of the Earth system. And I think importantly, it's because they're treated as a set rather than individual goals. Winning on one, but at the cost of losing on another, starts to actually be recognised, and so we're starting to put in checks and balances against those trade-offs. And so for me, part of the interesting thing about the SDGs is, for the first time, we actually have something of an integrated approach to deal with the whole array of different challenges ahead of us. And climate change is, of course, just one of those, one of the 17. But like most of the SDGs, there's elements in almost every SDG. So climate change relates to most of the other 16, poverty relates to most of the other 16, etc. And so I think that more comprehensive or holistic sort of view is one of the really big advantages there. And I don't think we should give up on them. I think we, simply because COVID has actually pushed us backwards, I think that just should resolve us to push forwards on them even harder.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more there for those points. Now, of course, with all of the experience that you've had and the heaps of different people that you've talked to, I can't help but not end this night by asking one important question, which is, out of all the scientists, all the government personnel, all of the community members that you've interacted with, what is the most ridiculous solution to climate change and air quality that you've come across?
Okay, I do have an answer for you here. Some years ago, there was this plan to hook up a pipe behind a tractor. And so as farmers were ploughing their field, they'd inject the exhaust down into the soil, and this would somehow store carbon in the soil. And so the rationale was you could drive your tractor to store carbon, whereas the reality, of course, is that driving the tractor chews up carbon, chews up diesel, emits that diesel, even if it goes through an exhaust pipe. But simply disturbing the soil actually releases the soil carbon as well. And so what was being proposed as a win-win solution was actually one of the worst lose-lose solutions I've ever heard.
Yeah,
and
that's definitely an interesting one.
Back to that point is that if you've got a well-informed populace who can actually ask critical questions, they don't fall for that. They say, well, this doesn't add up. Why are you trying to sell this to me? I've got better things to do with my money and my time. Go away. And so we need collectively to be able to recognize what a dodgy propositions, you know, new coal-fired power stations, that sort of thing, when renewables are much cheaper. You know, why would you even start having that conversation? And so, you know, why would you put taxpayers' money towards that rather than actually supporting rolling out of renewables and you know, more effective battery storage, etc. And so for me, a lot of it comes back to having a well-informed populace, you know, education, the time to think, the reward systems that actually, instead of elevating sports people to the top of our social pile, we should actually have scientists and psychologists and ethicists at the top of our pile, people who can actually take us forward.
Absolutely. And of course, the youth here today, they are definitely some people that can take us forward. So I remind you all to really listen to the messages that Mark has given and follow your values in whatever pathway that you take. We can definitely achieve it. And on that note, on behalf of ASIP, I want to thank you, Professor Mark Howden, for sharing your insight and expertise with us today. And thank you for everyone who's tuned in across the region. We hope you've learned something new and feel just that little bit more inspired and motivated to continue the conversation, not only with your friends who have joined, but others who couldn't make it here tonight, and of course, your community. And before you go, I'd just like to also share some current ASIP opportunities that we have going. So registrations are still open for our inaugural ASIP Reset, which is our ASEAN-Australian Youth Innovation Challenge. So if you have an idea on how to strengthen people-to relationships between youth across our region, perhaps in the realm of climate change, policy change, and implementing those innovations we heard about tonight, I highly encourage you to join. We also have our ASIP Spotlight series, which has just launched. So we're looking for young leaders in our region who are making positive social change and impact in their communities across the ASEAN and Australia to feature in a video that we're going to host. We'd encourage you to apply or nominate a friend that you think is doing something incredibly important right now. And for more information about these opportunities or to sign up to our monthly newsletter, make sure you head across to our ASIP website or follow the links that are being posted in the chat at the moment. So thank you everyone for joining, and I hope you enjoyed your evening.
Thanks again.
Bye.
Cheers.
Thank you so much.